Hi, and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. This is part 4 of a multi-part series on building an 80s style coin-operated retro arcade machine. If you haven't seen the previous parts, I'll leave links down in the video description, but in part 4, I'm going to focus on building the control panels, installing the coin door, marquee lighting in the speaker system, a little bit about painting and finishing the cabinet, adding a back door for access, and installing T-molding. It's a lot to cover, but let's get started. So at the end of part 3, we had completed most of the basic construction of the cabinet, including the monitor mounting, the bezel, and the marquee area. So there's really one major piece of the construction to go, and that's one of the most important, and that's the control panel. Now, the control panel can make or break your arcade machine. And your needs for a control panel might be completely different from mine, and it's going to be based somewhat on the types of games you want to play. Again, my goal were those 80s coin-op games, so that's what my control panel was going to focus on. So before I ever started, and again, I mentioned this in the first part of this series on designing and planning, and you might want to take a look at that if you want more detail, but I decided I was going to take the time to build a prototype first. So I went off to Amazon and I ordered some low-cost arcade parts just as a starter kit. Then a little bit of online searching, I found a button layout template. And this one actually had 8 buttons, and I figured I was only going to want to use 6 buttons, but I could still use this same template, at least for creating my prototype. And with those couple of items, I took a scrap piece of 1/2" MDF, cut it to an approximate size, did a sample layout of my controls, and got some practice at drilling my holes with a drill and a spade bit. Then I went ahead and hooked up those controls, put it in a sample box. Again, you can see part 1 of this for a little bit more detail on this, but I actually used it to try playing a number of games that I was going to want to play on my full arcade machine. So based on what I learned from the prototype, and knowing that I wanted to add things like a trackball and a spinner, which I cover in other parts of this series, I had my design laid out and I was ready to actually create the control panel for the arcade machine itself. So much like I did with my prototype, the first thing I did was to lay out my components approximately where I thought they were going to go. I had found my center spot, and also it's a little bit hard to see. I'd put an outline here of where the actual cabinet was going to be. For my design, the control panel was going to be flush on the sides with the cabinet itself. There would be a little bit of a lip overhanging in the front, and that was going to be to add that hinge so I could hinge the control panel up. And initially I was going to notch out the back here that would go around the sides of the cabinet. We'll see in a minute why that had to change. Once I had that done, I kind of laid out my components where where I thought they were going to go, and I'm glad I did this because I found out that the motor here on for the servo for my 4-way to 8-way joysticks was actually going to bump up against the side of the cabinet. So I kept having to finagle things and move things around till I got them where I wanted. Then I did final markings of everything, taped down my templates, used a nail and a hammer to put small starter holes into the board. Now notice I haven't cut this board off yet. I'm still working on getting everything drilled before I do that. But again, using the spade bit and a hole saw, eventually got everything cut out so it looked like this. Again, I still haven't trimmed this to length because I wanted to be able to put it on the cabinet before I did any kind of final cutting on the length. And here's the control panel sitting on the cabinet itself before these final cuts. Again, my initial plan was to notch this out around the sides of the cabinet so that this would come up flush against this back panel. But what I discovered is when you put the knob for the volume and the toggle switch on here, when this was up flush, you couldn't raise up the control panel because it was hitting these switches. So I ended up having to build a little lip, and I didn't go into detail on that on the cabinet construction, but if you're really interested in seeing how I screwed up this step and how I fixed it, all that is detailed in my blog article where I have the full build of the cabinet as well. So with that lip in place, what I was going to be able to do is actually just cut this straight across this line and not notch it, and I actually was going to make things a bit easier when it came to the plexiglass. So with that done came the step I had personally been dreading, and that was dealing with the plexiglass. I talked about it a little bit in the last segment of my struggles with the plexiglass, and I'd managed to get a good clean cut, but at this point I had no spare plexiglass. I had this one piece. So if I messed it up when it came time to drill these holes, I was going to be back to the hardware store, setting up my jig, cutting the plexiglass again, and starting all over. Not the end of the world, but I really was hoping I wouldn't have to do that. So while there might be better ways, this is the approach that I took. I took my plexiglass and I clamped it between a scrap piece of wood and my control panel laid face down. I then took the spade bit that I'd used to create each hole in the control panel and used that to create a starter hole in the exact center of each of the holes in the plexiglass. Once that was done with the starter holes in place, I was able to use a step bit, and I could get the exact hole that I wanted by going slowly without too much pressure and create each hole the exact size that I needed. And when I was done, I ended up with this. I was extremely happy, but the big elephant in the room and my big unknown was I still had to create this large hole for the trackball in the center of the plexiglass while not cracking or breaking anything. So lacking any other ideas, I decided to take the same approach for the large holes I did for the small hole. Remember, this is my first time working with plexiglass. There may be better ways to do this. So if you've got more experience with plexiglass, got other ideas of a better way to approach this, feel free to leave it down in the comments. But I decided again to clamp my plexiglass between a scrap piece of wood and my control panel, apply a little WD-40 to my hole saw, and then very slowly work my way through the plexiglass until I ended up with this. I was thrilled. It had worked. I didn't crack or didn't break anything. I will say that these holes look a little bit rough around the edges. That's really just the plastic protective sheet on the plexiglass, that when I peel that off, you'll see in a minute that those holes are actually cut pretty clean. So it worked. I was thrilled. I had my plexiglass cut. So really the last part remaining for the control panel was to cut the vinyl graphics. Again, these graphics came from a company called Game On Graphics. They're the same company that I ordered the Marquee graphics from. Again, you can find information on that in one of the prior parts of this series. But it's very easy just to lay that down, to cut the vinyl with an X-Acto knife, or you can even cut it with a pair of scissors. The only thing I wanted to be sure of was that I had the very center of the graphics right in the center of where that trackball was going to be. Once the holes were cut out, it was simply laying on the plexiglass and trimming the edges. And then here's the final control panel once I've actually removed the plastic protective sheet off of the plexiglass. And I must admit, I was really happy with how it turned out. The other thing I should mention here before I move off the control panel is the fact that the graphics are not attached to the control panel, nor is the plexiglass. It's actually all going to be held in place by the controls themselves. So you're going to have retaining rings and flanges on all of those. So once the controls are put into place, it'll all be held together. But that gives me the option, if I want to take all of the controls out, I could actually remove the plexiglass to either replace it if it gets cracked or damaged, or I could actually replace the graphics at some point in time. So while I talked a little bit in part one about what I call the administrative control panel, it's not something you would find on a standard 80s coin-operated arcade machine, but I did want a way to be able to control the volume of the cabinet. I wanted a Raspberry Pi power up, power down button, and I also wanted access to the unused USB ports on the Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to touch just a little bit here on the build of that administrative control panel. So one challenge that I ran into is while arcade buttons are meant to be installed in something that's a 1/2 inch or even a 3/4 inch thick, most push buttons or toggle switches you buy are meant to be installed in something like a car or a boat dash that's very thin. So once again, I created a test board and created some test holes, and what I found was I actually had to go in and route out some of the thickness of this wood so that the button would be able to mount. And here is the amplifier that I use to drive the speakers in the cabinet. As you can see, it's got a very short stem as well, again meant to be installed in a thin substrate like a dashboard. And in this case, there was no way I was going to be able to route out the back of the wood to be able to get that stem to stick through far enough to put a volume knob on the other side. So what I had to do to solve this problem was I actually had to buy a small coupler and then just bought a simple steel rod. Took that, cut off a small piece of the steel rod, used the coupler, and then just basically took a scrap piece of wood and a couple of angle brackets and mounted a small shelf for the amplifier. So once that problem is solved and the other buttons were in, again, we'll get into the wiring in the next part of this series, but that really completed the administrative control panel. So while that finishes up the majority of the construction, I did want to touch briefly on painting the cabinet. And the reason why is while the control panel is going to be the major factor in playability of your cabinet, the finishing and painting of that cabinet will play a big factor in how that cabinet looks in your house and the approval factor of being able to put that in your basement or your rec room. So the first step in finishing the cabinet was to fill all of those countersunk screw holes. This took probably at least 3 or 4 days. It was a matter of putting in wood putty, letting it dry, sand, repeat, 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 multiple times until you have completely smooth, filled holes that you can't feel any difference when you rub your hand across it. The reason this part is so important is this is the difference between doing a bad putty job, which is what I did on my prototype box, which wasn't that important. Threw a couple layers of wood putty on there and left it, versus what taking your time and doing it right looks like. Now, if you are going to put something like vinyl graphics or a vinyl wrap on the sides of your cabinet, this step might not be as important, but for me, I wasn't planning on using any vinyl graphics, so I wanted to be sure that you couldn't see those screw holes when I was done with the cabinet. So once all the putty work was done and I had a nice smooth surface, I was ready to apply a coat of gray tinted primer. Again, I'm planning on painting my cabinet black, so I went with a gray tinted primer. It just makes life a little bit easier. Then I also had to go ahead and prime all of the other things that I was going to be painting. In this case, it's the pegboard there is going to be the back door of the cabinet, and in the background there you can see the bezel. And I also opted to go ahead and paint my control panel, even though there was going to be graphics over the top of it. I decided to go ahead and paint it if I ever decided to remove the graphics at some point. So after priming, as I mentioned, I opted to paint my cabinet black. Now you could paint your cabinet any color you want. I opted to go with black because that was the predominant color of arcade machines. Again, they would be painted all different colors in the arcade, and a lot of them would have vinyl graphics on the side. I opted not to put graphics on the side of mine. So I started out with, I believe it was 2, maybe 3 coats of flat black on the cabinet and all of the components. The exception was the marquee area. I did go with a satin white in that area, and the only reason I painted the inside of what I'm calling the light box white was to give a little bit better reflection of the light behind the marquee area. Once I had the painting done, I came back and applied, I believe it was 3 coats of a satin polyurethane. I did want a little bit of sheen to this. I didn't want a high gloss, but again, I was trying to match what you would normally see in the arcades back in the 80s. So there were just a few other things to complete in the garage before I was ready to move the cabinet down to the basement for final assembly. First up was the coin door. That was extremely easy. It just went right into the cutout. Simply turned these little tabs to lock it into place. And again, it looked very nice from the front. So that was an extremely easy step to complete. Next, I opted to go ahead and install my lighting in the marquee area. I opted to use LED fluorescent style bulbs. I didn't want to mess with real fluorescent tubes and ballasts and all that. So again, I used LEDs here. This will, if these do go bad, they'll be very easy to replace, because if you recall, I was going to actually hinge the top of this. So I'll simply just lift up the hinge, be able to easily pull these out and replace them should they go bad in the future. Next were the 2 speakers. Again, very easy to mount over the cutouts that were already there. And then on the underneath side, simply apply the cover plates. So that was all pretty simple and straightforward. So it was at this point I did opt to go ahead and move the cabinet to its final resting place in the basement. Part of the reason I opted to do this now was pretty much the dirty work was over, but before I remounted the monitor back in there after doing all the painting, I wanted to go ahead and get it moved, not only to lessen the chance of potential damage, but really to keep things as light as possible. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this series, that MDF is heavy. So this was the second time in the entire process I did have to have a hand to take that cabinet, get it out of the garage, navigate it through the house, and down the stairs to the basement. But from that point on, all of the final work, including the wiring and all the programming, could take place with it in its final spot in our basement. So once the machine was down in the basement, I could go ahead and get the monitor, put it back in place, and then it was time to install that T-molding. Now, T-molding comes in different widths based on the width of your wood. And if you remember, I built the sides of my cabinet out of 3/4 inch MDF, but the control panel and the bezel and all of the front panels were built out of 1/2" MDF. So in my case, I actually had to have two different types of T-molding. I opted to go for blue for my 3/4 inch. Again, you can get this in just about any color you want. And I just decided to go with a different color of black for my 1/2 inch, which would be around my control panel and my bezel. The easiest way to do this is start at one edge and use a rubber mallet to gently tap that in place. Now, depending on the T-molding itself, it could be quite stiff. The black T-molding was much more stiff and less flexible than the blue. And what I found is using a hairdryer on a high setting or a heat gun on a low to medium setting is you can kind of soften up that T-molding as you work it in to the grooves. But if you take your time and a little bit patient, you can see here the finished T-molding. And just finally, a couple real quick pictures of the back door. Again, I opted to use pegboard just to allow some ventilation in the cabinet, although it really does not get that warm inside of there. And again, just a piano hinge was used along the length of that door with a small cutout here for the power cord. So that's going to wrap up part 4. We're getting really close to having a completed cabinet, and it won't be long before we'll be able to start playing games. But coming up in part 5, we're actually going to install all of those arcade controls into the control panel, see how they're all wired together, how they connect to the control board, and how the control board functions. We'll also take a look at other wiring within the cabinet itself, including power supplies, power routing, ventilation, lighting, and the audio-visual system. So stay tuned, that's coming up soon. So if you've seen anything in this video that you liked or found helpful, do me a favor and hit that like button. That lets both me and YouTube know you'd like to see more videos like this. If you'd like to see some of my other videos, you could also subscribe to my channel by hitting that subscribe button. And if you want to be notified when I release the next video in this series, ding that little bell icon. As always, I would like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.